brothers with all the handles. Yo, for the brothers with the killer crossovers. The brothers who got mad hops. And for the brothers with the baggy shorts. The GBA is coming to a gym for you. Get your spot in now. Peace.
Cash rules everything around me. Cream it.
Yeah. Check this old fly shit out. Word up.
Freedom Radio.
Live from the University of Minnesota. We're actually in the Sociology Department in the Social Studies building with Professor Doug Hartmann. And we are revisiting the legacy of the GBA and the city of Minneapolis and some of their politics around youth engagement, around different issues of ways to Doug, what was the intent? Was this supposed to curb youth violence at the time period, or how did you see the city's involvement?
Well, from the city's point of view, it was a part of their project of crime prevention. Softer way to say it would be social intervention. But it had grown out of the middle part of the 90s when there was a lot of shootings and gang violence. They were looking for solutions. What we learned, this was me just first moving here. I learned the city had done a lot of little programs, and none of them really worked. I mean, none of them actually even got any of who they thought the target population was even in the door. Right. Like they couldn't even find where young black men were with all these programs. But your guys' was one of the few ones that actually succeeded in at least reaching out and recruiting. So here's the thing I mostly remember. I went into that program with this idealized vision of what was going to happen on the ground, because I had just gotten done studying all this history and politics where it was all controversial, all racialized from above, and the forces of power inserting themselves in the world. And I thought with the Ghetto Basketball Association we're going to see blossoming up from below, kind of a more grassroots based thing. But that was, to me, what my dominant recollection is, the struggle.
Well, let me
okay.
So you're talking about your observations were in the context of studying midnight basketball and the way politics was used at the time, because you said we're dealing with the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and this is kind of toward the tail end of the crack years that was definitely a part of the black community fabric. And so there was this big move, and you can elaborate on this, around how to move the issue of youth violence into a more kind of distraction for the kids or the youth that were in those kind of neighborhoods, correct?
Absolutely. You're right to slow me down and back me up a little bit on this. Yeah, for me, midnight basketball grows out of the late 80s, early 90s, the supposed epidemics of crime and crack in the inner city. And to me, what midnight basketball was about, it took the worst stereotypes about black men.
We play basketball all the time, and that's all.
And use the best stereotypes about basketball as a solution to the problem. So, super predator criminals, the solution to that is superstar athletes. And so midnight basketball is kind of this crazy, innovative synthesis of both the worst stereotypes and the black stereotypes about the black man. That's what I was studying, right? And so I had been studying the crazy big level politics around that, and I wanted to get in on the ground. And that's what I thought you guys were up to. And I do think that's what you were running, a program that was trying to make the best in this context. But to get to your original question, what I really remember is how your vision of what you were trying to do with the program in basketball, which was about community empowerment, about pride, about possibilities for neighborhoods and positive outreach opportunities for black men in your communities, how that ran up against the city's ideas, which were really crime prevention. And assume that, the people who you thought you were really trying to organize and help were the problem. And so that's what I remember, even when I had, one or two of my students come along those first meetings.
Hold on. What do you mean by that? The people who we were trying to organize and help were the players.
Your players. For you, they're players. They're looking to play the game. Right. Whereas for the city, these are threats. Oh, okay. They're people who they thought were the problem. We got to figure out what to do with these guys, how to contain them, how to control them. So their vision of the program wasn't so much about helping your guys, much less letting them be athletes, as it was about creating a program to, get into the community, kind of keep it more stabilized, contain, control. That was the original idea of Minneapolis basketball. That's what it was about. I mean, it was about getting black guys off the streets during what people thought were the high crime hours. It wasn't about building character. It wasn't about community pride. It was about social control.
Okay, with that, and we know that you've, and this is in context to your book right here, Midnight Basketball, Race, Sports, and Neoliberal Social Policy. That's a really big. No. But this is a very real thing. At the time when you started studying these programs that came out of this time period, what other things nationally were happening that would have been comparable to something like the GBA in Minneapolis?
Well, it was all kinds of sports-based intervention programs was happening. So it was, and they were kind of the more liberal side of crime prevention, because the other side, the more conservative side, was all about policing, more prisons, more police, more social control. Part of my analysis of Midnight Basketball is it kind of lets the mainstream public have it both ways, because Midnight Basketball both plays to a little more softer liberal version.
Okay. And what for the listening audience, that word liberal, define that in terms of how you're saying it.
Gotcha. Here I'm really just talking about Democrats and Republicans in the 1990s. And Democrats were doing a soft version of crime prevention that usually used language like social intervention, proactive or preventative strategies, whereas the more conservative, the Republican side they were prisons and police and control, and those were coming up against each other in the crime bill and social policies at that time. And I think Midnight Basketball was at the center because it could kind of be read on both sides, and that's actually why I think there was both a Democratic president and a Republican president who both supported these programs at one time. Now, the other kind of programs that we might fit in here would be a lot of the welfare reform was happening at that time, where the Clinton years, where you're moving away from actually supporting communities and more to control women and make them go to work and limit like what they could use their money for and things like that. So this was the context when we met. That was the big context that I was coming from, is that what all these shifts were in public policy. And the racial side of this, to me, was and still is, this neoliberalism is both about the privatization of these programs and then making African American people and communities as the center of the problem, as opposed to how we can help these communities. It's like, that's the problem we have to contain and control. Those people are what's wrong. And that kind of racial stereotyping, that language, which sounds so abrupt and harsh, that was really what was going on in the 90s.
Well, okay, so since you studied this issue, and the GBA in Minneapolis did actually start as a Midnight Basketball League. This was 97, as we said. When did this phenomena, or what have you, used to achieve these, I guess, objectives from the politics of cities and their quote-unquote problems with urban youth? When did Midnight Basketball actually start to be institutionalized and connect from different cities, I guess?
Yeah. So the official programs, the first one started late 80s, early 90s. That was the first one was like outside of Washington, D.C., Prince George's County. Oh, okay. And then the next big one, and the one where it really got prominent nationally, was in Chicago, with the Bulls. And so like Doug Collins and Michael Jordan were like supposedly team owners, and they wrote it up in the Sun Times and stuff like that. So that's where it started, and then and that was still under Republicans. And one of the guys who was really into it was Jack Kemp, who is the director or the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Exactly. And he was like a football player, a white guy, but who had this idea that sports was good for race relations. But it was also cheap. Like, he was a supply side, free market economics. So this was the origins. Now, what happened is in 94, Clinton starts to take it on. That's when the national politics explode around Midnight Basketball. And that, I was kind of mentioning how it could be both Democrat and Republican. After 94, that wasn't the case anymore, because Republicans really turned on Midnight Basketball, and they then started characterizing Midnight Basketball as an example of everything that's wrong with liberal Democrat crime policy. They use this language like it was cozying up to criminals.
Well, What year was this?
This was 94.
Okay, nice.
And so I have a whole chapter of the book's on this. I think they use midnight basketball as a racial code, a way to attack all kinds of crime policy revisions. Now, that's all kind of ancient history in a sense. For GBA, what matters is you guys were starting up kind of a variation on this at a time that it was really all that was left was kind of the liberal side of it, the more democratic vision. And I think what's a little dangerous, and we sometimes forget, is that there was a lot of racism under that too, under the Clinton administration. So, and that was to me kind of this undercurrent. And so when it starts in Minneapolis, I think it's a kind of democratic initiative, but it has a lot of racial stereotypes in it and a lot of racial assumptions. And so now it's only on the kind of liberalish side. But that's to me part of what I remember you guys were running up against, because I don't want to be too unfair to you, but I'd say you kind of had a vision that was going to be able to get beyond some of that, right? Not get swept up into or controlled by the large political forces, because you were thinking of a more bottom-up, grassroots, community-based kind of initiative.
Yeah, definitely something that was empowering to ownership among all the politics of the city and the interesting dynamics of politics and money, especially in different coordinated things from all ways that the city has attachments to people, places, and things. But we're going to deal with that in the next segment. A quick question before we take our next break. 1997, what was kind of your general assessment of the black community in context of other cities? What did Minneapolis's black community at that time period, what were some things that stood out, and what was the population like, at least in terms of the this kind of target population of black youth specifically?
Boy, I have to think back a little bit. And my sense is I probably learned a lot of that from you and hanging out with you and the guys in the program, to the extent I learned stuff. But a couple things. One is just like lack of resources, and you looking for jobs, maybe looking for training opportunities, and I know you tried to build that into the program. So that kind of stands out, is like communities that were looking for something, that were looking for resources and assistance and support, and just trying to gather it together however you could, right? I also definitely remember the energy and excitement, not only around basketball, but about the entrepreneurial stuff you were doing with basketball, with hip-hop. And I think that wasn't just you. I think that was part of, in this kind of almost desert of resources, it's like there's this tremendous energy of people who are looking for things. And then the other thing I would say that's really specific to sports is like where could we play sports? Where could we have physical fitness? Because I really remember this, because we researched that, is how the parks were taking out the basketball courts, how the gyms weren't publicly accessible anymore. It was pay to play, or it was removal of public facilities. So if you didn't have money to go to gyms or to go to Lifetime or whatever, you're kind of left out. So that's, to me, one of the other things I remember. And actually, I go back to this at the end of the book, which isn't the chapter specifically about you, but I'm thinking about that program. Is one of the innovative things was just we just want a place to play our game. And there just wasn't a lot of resources and facilities because public funding was getting cut for everything.
Well, you're absolutely right, and it actually triggers some memories, because this is a time period. We're talking about 1997, so we're talking about basically the tail end of that crazy years that crack had an impact in the black community, and you're really talking about the leftover of the damage. You know what I'm saying? So this would have been the front line of the cleanup movement. From, I guess, the city, looking at the community and different things that were happening, different needs for opportunities and different needs for potentially, I guess, to identify who was left of the war on the black community. So, this was definitely a period of time, not only in Minneapolis, but nationally, I'm sure, where park and recreation centers, community centers were closing their gyms because of problems within the community that spilled over from the influx of drugs and that kind of energy that it sometimes brings towards open gyms and basketball in a certain age group. It also was a time where different things here locally in this city and other cities, even that spilled out to club venues. Could black artists really come in town in hip hop and secure a venue to perform because of these kind of issues, i.e. the closing of Glam Slam in Minneapolis that went to be under a different name called The Quest, owned still by Prince. But those issues, First Avenue not necessarily being accommodating to black artists at that time if you were a black promoter. So there's a lot of different intersections of race and sports and like the things that you was talking about that I want to get into, and we might have to actually chop up the next part of this interview where you interview me and I interview you a little bit. I was
thinking that same thing. This is like your
yeah. So we'll be right back after this break.
Freedom Radio.
Yeah.